It's 2009, a courtroom in Germany. A man in an army dress uniform sits at the defense table while a judge reads a verdict. Guilty of premeditated murder, life in prison. His name is John Hatley, Master Sergeant, 20 years in uniform, 2 Bronze Stars, Desert Storm, 3 tours in Iraq. He's the kind of soldier the Army builds careers around, and now the Army is sending him to a prison cell for the rest of his life. Halfway around the world, another soldier is in another courtroom. First Lieutenant Michael Behenna, Army Ranger, 101st Airborne, 25 years. His crime? He says he was ambushed by a man he'd already let go. The court says it was murder. Here's what I want you to sit with before we go any further. The same military system that sent those men into some of the most dangerous places on earth, that gave them split-second rules they couldn't always follow and sometimes couldn't understand. That same system is now putting them in federal prison. The group that formed around their cases came to be called the Leavenworth 10. Not always 10, not always at Leavenworth, but always the same story. Soldiers who fought the war their country asked them to fight, and then came home to face it again, this time in a courtroom. This is that story. To understand what happened to the Leavenworth 10, you need to understand what Iraq looked like from ground level, not from the briefing rooms or the think tanks, but from the streets. By 2005, the mission had turned into something nobody had planned for. There were no front lines. There was no uniform on the enemy. Every car was a possible bomb. Every house on a quiet street was a possible ambush. The soldier beside you could be dead before you heard the shot. The Sunni Triangle, Al-Abnar Province, Baghdad's western neighborhoods. These weren't just place names. They were places where American soldiers watched their friends die and then had to keep doing their jobs the next morning. In 2004, Abu Ghraib broke into the news. Photographs of American soldiers humiliating Iraqi detainees. The images were real. The outrage was justified. But what happened next had consequences nobody talks about nearly enough. The rules got tighter. After Abu Ghraib, the Army was under a microscope. JAG officers, military lawyers, were embedded with units in ways they hadn't been before. The detention process got more complicated. To hold an insurgent, you now needed documented evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. In the middle of a firefight, in a country where witnesses wouldn't testify and paperwork got shot up alongside people. Soldiers on patrol were capturing men they knew were fighters. Men caught near weapons caches. Men seen fleeing a firefight. Men who'd been on intelligence watch lists for months. And then releasing them, because the paperwork wasn't right, because the evidence wasn't airtight, because the lawyers said there wasn't enough to hold them. And those same men would be back on the streets by morning. They're gonna be right back on the streets. That's what one of the soldiers in John Hatley's unit said on a taped Army interrogation. Not as justification, just as a fact. That was the world they were living in. The rules of engagement during this period were genuinely confusing, not as an excuse, but as a documented reality. They changed. They were sometimes contradictory. What was permitted in one sector wasn't permitted in another. What was legal under one commander's interpretation wasn't under the next. And the consequences for guessing wrong now included not just death in combat, but prosecution back home. This is the environment the Leavenworth 10 came out of. May 9, 2006, a Black Hawk helicopter drops a squad of soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division onto a small island in a lake called Tartar, about 200 miles north of Baghdad. Private First Class Corey Claggett is 21 years old. He grew up in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, enlisted right out of high school, and ended up here. A tiny island in the middle of Al-Qaeda territory that Army intelligence has flagged as a training camp. The rules of engagement for this mission, soldiers would later testify, were to treat all military-aged males in the area as hostile. Kill or capture. Don't let them go. When the squad clears a house, they find 3 men hiding inside, using women as human shields. They take the men into custody. Then their squad leader, Staff Sergeant Raymond Girard, gives an order: let them go, and shoot them as they flee. Claggett follows the order. He and another low-ranking soldier shoot the unarmed men in the back. Here's where it gets complicated. Shooting unarmed men in the back, even under orders, violates the laws of war. Following an unlawful order is not a defense. That's been a principle of military justice since Nuremberg. Claggett himself later acknowledged it was wrong. But Girard, the man who gave the order, had his own charges eventually dismissed on appeal. He received back pay, an honorable discharge. Claggett served 10 years. Claggett pleaded guilty to murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 18 years and served 10 before parole. The University of Chicago Law School's Combat Clemency Project later took up his case, arguing he had been punished far more severely than the man who gave the order. "I was just a private," Claggett said after his release. "I looked up to the higher officers. We thought they were following the rules." Whether you believe him or not, and reasonable people disagree, his case illustrates the central wound running through all of the Leavenworth 10 stories. The men at the bottom of the chain of command paid the highest price, while the men above them often walked away. Spring 2007, Baghdad, West Rashid neighborhood. First Sergeant John Hatley's unit, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, gets into a firefight with a group of Iraqi men. The soldiers chase them to a house several blocks away. Inside, they find women and children, weapons, ammunition. The men are taken into custody. The problem: there's not enough documentation to formally detain them under the rules in place at the time. Hatley has options. He can try to push the paperwork through. He can release them. Or, according to prosecutors, he can do something else. Prosecutors say Hatley, along with Sergeant First Class Joseph Mayo and Sergeant Michael Leahy, a medic, loaded the 4 bound and blindfolded detainees into a vehicle, drove them to a canal on the Al-Rashid district, and shot each one in the back of the head, then dumped their bodies in the water. No bodies were ever found. No blood evidence. No physical evidence of any kind. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of soldiers from Hatley's own unit, soldiers who faced their own charges and made deals. Hatley maintained his innocence throughout the entire process. He says they released the men. He refused to admit guilt even when the Army told him that doing so might help him get parole. He spent more than 11 years in federal prison. He was released in 2020. Mayo and Leahy both pleaded guilty. Mayo received 20 years. Leahy received 20 years. Their testimony was the cornerstone of the case against Hatley. A military jury convicted Hatley of premeditated murder and conspiracy in 2009. He was sentenced to life in prison. The sentence was later reduced to 40 years, and he became eligible for parole. Read through the case materials, the Army's own interrogation tapes, the complete absence of physical evidence, the fact that the prosecution depended entirely on witnesses who made deals to save themselves, and you're left with real questions that have never been fully answered. Hatley was a highly decorated soldier with 20 years of honorable service. He's either a man who ordered an execution or a man who was convicted of a crime that nobody can prove happened. The court made its determination. History is still working on its. April 21, 2008, north of Baghdad. A massive roadside bomb destroys the patrol vehicle of First Lieutenant Michael Behenna's platoon. 2 of his soldiers are killed. 2 more are wounded. Behenna is 24 years old, a Ranger-tabbed officer commanding 18 men in the 101st Airborne Division. The 2 soldiers who died weren't just his subordinates. They were men he knew, men whose families would get phone calls. Army intelligence identifies a suspect, Ali Mansour, a man believed to be linked to the Al-Qaeda cell responsible for the bombing. Mansour is picked up, interrogated, and because investigators can't directly tie him to the explosion with sufficient evidence, ordered released. Behenna is given the assignment: drive Mansour back to his home village and let him go. Behenna doesn't do that. Instead, he takes Mansour to a railroad culvert outside of town, alone except for his interpreter. He strips Mansour and questions him at gunpoint about the bombing that killed his men. What happens next is disputed. Behenna says Mansour lunged for his weapon. He fired twice, once in the chest, once in the head, and killed him. He then left the body and reported the incident to Iraqi police the following day. The army prosecuted him for unpremeditated murder in a combat zone. He was convicted in 2009 and sentenced to 25 years, later reduced to 15. Here's where it gets worse. During the trial, the prosecution had brought in a forensic expert, a specialist named Dr. Herbert McDonald, to help evaluate the physical evidence. McDonald ran his own analysis and concluded, in a private meeting with prosecutors, that Behenna's account of what happened, Mansour lunging, grabbing for the weapon, was physically consistent with the evidence. The body positioning, the bullet trajectories. McDonald's findings supported the self-defense claim. The prosecutors sent him home. They never called him as a witness. They never disclosed his findings to the defense. Behenna's defense attorneys didn't find out about McDonald until after the verdict was delivered. This is what's known as a Brady violation, named for Brady versus Maryland, the 1963 Supreme Court case establishing that prosecutors must disclose evidence favorable to the defense. It's one of the foundational rules of American criminal justice, and the prosecution violated it. An Army appellate court noted concern about how the trial had handled Behenna's self-defense claim. His sentence was reduced. He was paroled in 2014 after serving 5 years. In 2019, President Trump issued him a full pardon. His parents, an FBI intelligence analyst and a federal prosecutor, had fought for 5 years to free their son. Behenna said he almost didn't answer the phone when the White House called because he didn't recognize the number and thought it was a telemarketer. The Leavenworth 10 isn't a fixed group. The number floats. The faces change as men finish their sentences or get paroled, but the pattern underneath all of them is consistent, and it's worth naming directly. The New Yorker, working with the Pulitzer Center, identified more than 150 criminal cases from Iraq and Afghanistan in which the military's own justice system flagged conduct as warranting prosecution. They identified more than 570 alleged perpetrators. Only 130 were convicted. That's the accountability problem from One Direction, a military system that, in most cases, didn't meaningfully punish the people it identified as having done wrong. But the Leavenworth 10 cases point to a different problem, not the absence of accountability, but the selective application of it. In 2005, Marines killed 24 civilians in the Iraqi town of Haditha. Women, children, an elderly man in a wheelchair. They were killed in a sweep after a roadside bomb hit a Marine convoy. 8 Marines were charged. 6 had their charges dropped. 1 was acquitted. The last one standing, Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterick, the squad leader who told his men to shoot first and ask questions later, pleaded guilty to a single count of dereliction of duty. He served no prison time. He was demoted to private. 24 civilians. No prison time. Meanwhile, John Hatley was serving a life sentence for the deaths of 4 combatants, with no physical evidence, no bodies, and a case built on testimony from men who'd cut deals. Michael Behenna was serving 24 years for a killing that a prosecution expert believed was self-defense, evidence the prosecution chose not to share. The families of the Leavenworth 10 used a specific word: scapegoats. They believed their sons and brothers had been sacrificed to show the governments of Iraq and Afghanistan that the United States took accountability seriously, while the cases that generated the most damaging headlines, the cases that came with photographs and international coverage, quietly fell apart. Military lawyers would push back on this. Former military prosecutor Michelle McClure argued that court-martial juries understood the fog of war, that they factor combat stress into their verdicts, and that the system works as designed. And she's not entirely wrong. The military justice system does have safeguards that civilian courts don't. But it also has a 98% conviction rate at court-martial. If a case gets that far, the odds are almost entirely against the defendant. And the men at the bottom of the command structure, the privates and sergeants and lieutenants, are the ones who tend to get that far. The colonels and generals rarely do. In 2010, as major American combat operations in Iraq were winding down, a group of families gathered in Leavenworth, Kansas for a motorcycle rally. They weren't celebrating a victory. They were trying to make sure the country didn't forget their sons. Vicki Behenna, Michael's mother, a federal prosecutor who'd worked on the Oklahoma City bombing case, became the public face of the campaign to free her son. She'd spent her career on the other side of the courtroom, and she believed deeply in the rule of law. That made her advocacy harder and more credible. She wasn't dismissing the military justice system. She was saying it had failed her son specifically, in ways that were documented and verifiable. Unless you see your men die in battle and don't know where the next bomb is coming from, she said, I think it's unfair for us to second-guess their actions. The families of the other men in the group made similar arguments. They weren't claiming their sons were perfect. They were saying the system had applied its power unevenly, and that their sons were the ones who paid the price for decisions made above their pay grade. A Texas congressman, Brian Babin, wrote to President Trump in 2017 asking for a full review of all the Leavenworth 10 cases. His letter made the same point the families had been making for years. These men face decisions that a tiny fraction of the population will ever have to make, under conditions that most of us will never experience, in a war that their country sent them to fight. Trump's pardons of both Behenna and Army Lieutenant Clint Lawrence, another Leavenworth 10 figure, convicted of ordering the shooting of 2 suspected Taliban scouts in Afghanistan, drew criticism from military justice experts who argued that pardoning soldiers convicted by their peers undermined the accountability the system was designed to provide. Those critics weren't wrong either. The law matters. The rules of war exist for reasons. They protect civilians. They protect captured enemies. They protect the moral foundation of what the military is supposed to be. But when the same system that produces a life sentence for John Hatley, with no physical evidence and a compromised witness pool, produces no prison time at all for the man who ordered his men into a civilian home with a shoot-first directive, you have to ask hard questions about what accountability actually means. There's a detail in John Hatley's story that I keep coming back to. While he was in prison, after his sentence had been reduced to 40 years, after his appeals had failed, after more than a decade had passed, the Army told him there was a path to parole. All he had to do was admit guilt and express remorse. He refused. He maintained that the killings never happened, that he and his men released those 4 detainees and walked away. The Army said he was guilty. He said he wasn't. He sat in that cell year after year and would not say otherwise. Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he's not. The court made its decision based on what was presented. But there's something in that refusal. A man who wouldn't perform contrition he doesn't feel, even when it costs him years of his life. That says something about the kind of soldier he believed himself to be. The Leavenworth 10 didn't form because soldiers were above accountability. Some of the men associated with the group did things that were genuinely wrong and knew it. The group existed because the people who loved these soldiers believed the system had weighed the scales unevenly, that the men who gave the worst orders served no time, that the men who followed those orders, or who made terrible decisions in terrible moments, carried everything. The war in Iraq will be argued over the rest of our lifetimes. The decisions that sent those soldiers there, the strategies that shaped the conflict, the policies that created the detention rules that couldn't be followed in the field. Those arguments are still very much alive. But in a federal prison in Kansas, a group of men served long sentences for actions taken in a war that their country is still figuring out how to reckon with. Some of them were guilty. Some of them had their convictions questioned by the very courts that handed them down. Some of them are out now, trying to rebuild their lives that got shattered in courtrooms after the combat was over. They went where they were sent. They fought the way they were trained. And then they came home to a system that, in case after case, was harder on the men at the bottom than the men at the top. That's not just their story. That's the story of every war America has ever fought. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which story from this era you think deserves more attention, and I'll see you in the next one.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?